Hello and welcome to this review of my Matias Tactile Pro 4 keyboard. I've had a lot of requests to review a Matias keyboard, and here it finally is. This is the PC version with a UK layout, but they do other layouts like ANSI as well, and they also sell a Mac version. Full disclosure, this keyboard was sent to me by Matias for review, so it's a sponsored video. Nonetheless, I insisted that I be allowed to do the video impartially and say exactly what I think of it as usual, as I personally think impartiality is one of the most important aspects of my videos. So even though this video is sponsored, it's still a genuine reflection of what I honestly think of it. Matias is a Canadian company formed by Edgar Matias in 1990, famous for this keyboard, the Tactile Pro, or rather the original Mac version of it, which is loosely a modern recreation of Apple's best and most famous keyboard, the AEK, of which I've done 2 reviews in the past. Click the link to check those out. The AEK used Alps Switches, which, like cherries, came in many varieties. In my Alps trilogy of videos, I explained the background and history of these switches, and now it's time to extend that a little further. See, Alps Switches changed quite a lot over the course of several cost-saving redesigns and went through many iterations, as I showed in last week's OmniKey video. Originally, they used a rather complicated switching assembly known as a switch plate, which is basically a 6-part sandwich of metal contact plates and plastic spacers with a contact leaf on top. These switches are known as the SKCL/SKCM series, better known as complicated Alps for the intricacy of that switch plate. In the late 90s, Alps phased the production of these switches out in favor of a simplified design, which used a basic 2-part metal switching assembly instead of the complicated switch plate. They had these switches produced in conjunction with a company called Forward Electronics, who had previously also produced complicated switches for them for a while. However, in 2000, Alps ended their venture with Forward, which is when the Alps branding disappeared from the switches. Forward still kept making them as they were used by several companies, including Matias, for their keyboards. That said, demand for mechanical keyboards declined, and production threatened to stop at one point. Matias, who were reliant on Forward supply, then committed to an order of 1 million switches required to keep the factory alive, but even that would come to an end in 2012 when production stopped forever. At this point, Matias could either give up or switch to a different type of switch like Cherry MX, but they didn't really want that, so they made their own switches based on Alps's design, which took 2 years to accomplish. As such, Matias is basically the modern Alps torchbearer, passing on the tradition. Matias switches are more or less clones of simplified Alps, except they are an updated version of them. There were several problems and limitations with the simplified design that Matias improved on, so although in many ways they're clones, they're also quite different. One of the limitations, for example, was that you could not have both an integrated LED in the switch as well as a clicker, which even the complicated switches were limited to. This is because the LED and the clicker take up the same space inside the switch, so you can't have both, and therefore LED Alps are always linear. Matias solved this by casting the switch out of a transparent plastic so that they could put LEDs under the switches rather than in them. This way there was still room for a clicker inside. Also, they reduced the notorious ping of simplified switches, which was caused by excessively thin springs. Allow me to demonstrate on this Unikey here. Quite loud indeed. And they also upped the lifetime of the switches by using gold-plated contact points, curved rather than bent steel, and higher grade materials. Complicated Alps had a lifetime of 20 million keystrokes, simplified Alps 10 million. Matias switches last longer than either at 50 million keystrokes. They currently make a clicky version with a white slider, a dampened tactile switch with a grey slider, and a dampened extra light linear one with a red slider. Despite the name Tactile Pro, this keyboard uses the clicky version. As you would expect of an Alps-like switch, it's very loud, but it's a good sound. It's significantly bassier and deeper than simplified white Alps. I give you a quick side-by-side for that.
It doesn't ping quite as loudly as simplified white Alps, but it still pings quite a lot. I'm not sure if it's caused by the plate or the springs, but it's very noticeable.
It's definitely not as deep or as full as the old complicated white Alps that came before it though. Comparing it to a more contemporary keyboard, and in fact one of its long-standing rivals, a Cherry G80 3000 with clicky blue cherry switches, there's barely any comparison here though.
The cherry sounds super plasticky and almost dead by comparison.
Now you might think that the key feel of Matias switches is quite similar to complicated Alps as well, but it's definitely not.
First of all, they're weighted at 60 grams rather than 70 grams, so they feel lighter. Moreover, they're more tactile than complicated Alps, so if you think complicated Alps were too stiff or not tactile enough, you might enjoy the Matias switches better. That said, the contact leaf in Matias switches adds a quite noticeable second bump right at the bottom of the keystroke, which makes it feel a little bit less refined and a bit clunky by comparison. Compared to Cherry's, there's a world of difference. Because of the rudimentary way in which Cherry achieves tactility in their switches, you can barely call the Cherries tactile at all compared to the Matias's. The Cherries practically feel like mush if you try them out side by side actually.
The board itself is fairly well built. It weighs a somewhat average 1.2 kilos, just a little bit lighter than the Ciccone I showed earlier, or a Dell Bigfoot. But it comes with a metal mounting plate, and although the case looks like it's fairly hollow, it's held together very well,
and it doesn't rattle at all. See, it sounds pretty damn sturdy, that.
The case is a very shiny black plastic, which tends to attract dust a bit, but it does give it a nice, sleek look. Similarly, the reverse side of the case,
and even the flip-out feet, are made out of this shiny black stuff. The feet are very, very stiff, by the way, probably because they're still so new. It comes with a fairly standard black uncoiled USB connector.
Overall, build quality is not bad, definitely.
The keycaps are thin lasered ABS, but it's not the same lasering you're used to. Normally, lasering just burns a darkened groove into keycaps, but because these keycaps are black, that obviously doesn't work. Instead, these caps are made out of a material that kind of turns into a white stuff when burnt, which is how they create the lettering. Pretty clever tech. Of course, they are Alps mount, so if you don't like them, you can replace them pretty easily. And Matias have acquired some tooling to make PBT caps in the future as well. In taking with their Mac background, they went for having the letters at the bottom left rather than the top left. But thankfully, they didn't go for that horrific italic font that the AEK used. And they put the homing bumps on the correct caps, the F and J keys, rather than D and K like Apple used to do. Note that the lock keys use integrated LEDs with windows in the caps, rather than having a separate lock light bank, which is a little nod to many old Alps boards which often use this.
It's got a couple of extra features, such as playback buttons and volume buttons here, and as many as 3 USB ports, one to either side and one to the back here, which is really, really useful because I never have enough USB ports and certainly not in range.
They also put the numlock key here rather than on the numpad, and in its place they put an extra tab key, which is really useful if you work with spreadsheets and numbers like I do a lot.
Overall, this is a good keyboard. I like it. Good build quality, sleek looks, I really like the extra USB ports, and it's got nice switches. It's a solid product. Note that it is a bit expensive though, $150. For that kind of money you can get all sorts of gaming keyboards with features absolutely necessary for gaming, such as cyber-like fonts and backlighting in a million billion colors. But the thing is, this wasn't developed for gamers, it's made for typists. And as a keyboard for typists, it's pretty excellent.
The switches don't sound or feel quite as refined as the old Alps switches, but some might actually prefer the lighter weighting and the stronger tactility of these compared to complicated Alps. And of course you can still get these brand new, while finding a good Alps board can be a major pain in the ass. Finally, compared to cherry switches, these just wipe them off the table. It's not even a match really, I'd say.
So, if you're a crazed collector like me, you probably won't be 100% satisfied until you get some 80s behemoth with blue Alps, but for all those who just want a proper, solid typing experience on a modern keyboard, here it is. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.